On the 22nd of July 2011, Norway suffered the worst act of mass murder by a terrorist acting alone in the history of the world.
I stopped thinking, and I said my last prayer.
It was a race to solve the mystery of the killer's identity.
They said, "This is the guy." And I said, it can't be.
The killer claimed his cruelty had a purpose, articulated in a political manifesto. A vision of a Muslim invasion of Europe. A declaration of war unleashed on his own people.
What struck me more?
For Eskil Pedersen, the summer of 2011.
There's been an explosion in Oslo.
In the beginning, of course, it was very confusing because it was, first of all, not quite sure whether this was an attack or an accident. Then the police confirmed that this was an attack bomb.
And devastated the tower block that housed the Prime Minister's office. One of the first clues to these streets.
Muslims were scared.
Had called in to report a suspect dressed as a policeman fleeing the scene.
And Breivik, of course, because that name was connected with this big crime. Even his
Anders Breivik certainly seemed an unlikely terrorist. A 32-year-old Norwegian, raised in an upper-middle-class neighbourhood in Oslo. A family friend recalled, he was never difficult, only a kind, shy and sweet little boy. Breivik would later claim he had planned his operation for over 8 years, gathering funds, physical training, and 2 months spent constructing the homemade car bomb. On the shore across from the island, a local man had heard the shots and started to film.
Nå skyter de på Utøya. Men hva skjedde? Båten kjørte over da?
He filmed people fleeing in the only other boat available, an old rowing boat, and other desperate escape attempts.
De har begynt å svømme. Det langt å svømme, altså. De har faktisk begynt å rømme øya.
Håper purken kommer snart, da. Hvorfor det ikke noen sirener eller noe som helst der?
For the next hour, the young people on the island were defenseless. The police began studying Breivik's 1,500-page manifesto and accompanying YouTube video. An extraordinarily detailed outline of his planning, preparation, and the justification for his attacks.
Det ble grundig, så det foregikk et ganske intenst arbeid I forhold til å finne ut om det kunne være mer på gang I forhold til ondsinnede handlinger.
Throughout his manifesto, Breivik accuses left-wing politicians in the Labour Party of conspiring to allow Muslims to take over Norway. His Oslo bomb had targeted the adult leaders. On Utøya, he was killing the Labour Party's leaders of tomorrow. The massacre had gone on for more than half an hour when the local police received an extraordinary call.
kommandør Anders Behring Breivik I den norske antikommunistiske motstandsbevegelsen. Jeg på Utøya for øyeblikket.
Delta Force had now met the police boat and were journeying across the fjord. A local man caught their progress on film. Believing there might be more than one gunman, Delta had decided to fill the boat with officers. The boat was overloaded, took on water, and eventually stopped. Delta had to be rescued by a local boatman.
I realized the same time there was a helicopter up in the air. So I believe it is the helicopter which probably distracted him into not shooting.
But the helicopter was not the police. It was a news crew. They began to film the island. Kids swimming in the water. And the Delta Force, who had finally arrived. The police raced to the rocks and spotted the suspect in the trees.
De ser da at han har en uniform på seg. De ser at han har en pistol på hofta. Personen etterkom ikke de ordre som blir ropt. Han fortsetter å gå imot dem. Akkurat samtidig så etterkommer Breivik de ordre som blir ropt. Men det klart at her var det snakk om tiendedeler, hvor mine mannskaper måtte ha foretatt seg alle gjort noe.
Incredibly, the terrorist had been captured alive. Finally, 8 months after the attacks, the police and Prime Minister apologized for the failures of the response. While on the island, the man responsible for the worst attack on Norway since the Second World War was being held for interrogation. His identity would shock the nation.
I went on to Facebook, and I know this guy. I went to school with him. It's not him. It was a guy that I had known for many years of my life. The shock for me was that someone that I felt wasn't miles apart from in background from myself could have done something like this.
I think that's the most important thing we can learn from the terror of Utøya. Anders Behring Breivik was right. Facing hatred like this and facing act like this is difficult anyway for anybody. And facing it as a part of yourself is difficult. It's difficult.
His behavior deepened the mystery.
Det som har gjort sterkest inntrykk på meg som et bitte lite skrubbsår han selv hadde fått, og som han var bekymret for.
2 weeks after the attack, the police took Breivik back to Utøya to interrogate him. The head of the investigation, Paul Krabi, was watching.
The atmosphere of him being back at Utøya was very strange, knowing what he had done and also still seeing signs at the scene of the crime of what he had done. It was quite shocking to hear. What struck me most was how calm he was, how well-spoken and how polite it was. It was a big contrast to the terrible things he had done. Not at any point did we ever hear any regrets from him.
Når det gjelder hvorfor han har gjort det, så...
Jeg vil jo si at det å mene, altså det å ha forestillinger om at muslimer kommer til å overta herredømme i Europa i løpet av 20 år, det er det mange mennesker som tror, uten at de er psykotiske.
And there were other questions.
Hvis man skal være utilregnelig, så må man ha positive symptomer, det vil si vrangforestillinger, at man kan ha hørsels- eller syn.
Bankrupt. Many of the theories that seek to explain Breivik's radicalization focus on this moment.
I think that is really the turning point. From the police records, it seems like he is locking himself in his room for a year and a half. He starts to wear a face mask inside because he's so scared of bugs and...
Breivik's alleged personal troubles coincided with a period of mass immigration to Norway. By 2010, a quarter of Oslo's population were immigrants. It was a shock to Norway's traditionally ethnically homogeneous society.
In Oslo, we are getting something we 20 years ago wouldn't have thought of. We are getting a division geographically, where on the east side immigrants live, and in some schools they are 95%.
Breivik blamed this transformation on the Norwegian Labour Party. And though his position was extreme, he was far from alone in all his ideas. Before leaving his mother's house to carry out the attacks, Breivik emailed his manifesto to people he identified as sympathizers across Europe. More than 1,000 of them. But though he denounces Breivik's actions, Simonsen does not condemn all of Breivik's ideas. Far from it.
Så vil jeg nesten si at 90% av det manifestet egentlig hentet fra seriøse kilder. Jeg tror han har bred støtte for en tanke om at Norge før...
I was thinking, I don't want to do this. Then I thought, this is now or never.
I thought for about a minute. My whole body resisted. There were 100 voices in my head saying, stop. I spared a young boy crying hysterically. I told him he'd be okay. He was too young. Normal emotions until 2006 when I started my training. I see the families of those whose lives I have destroyed. It's horrible knowing the suffering I have created.
How he'd removed all emotion from this. I've dehumanized myself, he said. Through 5 years of meditation, I no longer experience joy, fear, happiness or sadness. Breivik acknowledged he'd inflicted terrible suffering on the relatives of his victims, but he didn't think about it and he didn't want to try.
There are another 9 weeks of all this for a man who admits what he did, but says he's not guilty of murder.
The court will decide if Breivik is insane or not. He believes history will be his final judge. His manifesto declares his attacks mark the beginning of a war which will last for decades.